we entitled Questions That Jesus Asked. And, stop that. I saved, wow. Try that, all right. I saved which for me was the most complicated to the last. So, we're going to look at the parable. We've been leading up to this. Some people refer to the parable as the parable of the persistent widow, or some people refer to it as the parable of the unjust judge. But just thinking about this last question, dealing with faith, and we've been talking about what faith is. And we know the famous passage that faith is defined as the evidence, basically the evidence for the things that we can't see. And we talked about how that there are a lot of things that we can't see, but we know are there because we can read the evidence. And it's a peculiar thing to me that we can understand that, and that the world can understand that, and every application except God. That we can understand, we talked about lift with an airplane, and you can't see that lift, but you can see the result. You can't see the wind that creates that lift, but you can see the result. The plane goes up in the air. We can't read a puppy's mind, but you can see the love in a puppy when that puppy bonds with a child and they grow up together. And if something threatens that child, oh no, that dog's not standing for it. But you can see in their eyes that love, that bond. Now, can we read that dog's mind? No. So there is something there, that bond, that love, that is unseen, but we have evidence for it. Many things we know to be true, but we don't have direct evidence. We have implied evidence, unseen things. But why, when it comes to God, a belief in the Bible, a belief in the resurrection, why is it that people, normal people, who would completely understand unseen things supported by evidence, why do they draw the line and say, oh no, I don't have any evidence, I can't believe in it? Why would that be the case? And let me, before you respond, we read it in the Bible of all the miracles, of all the teaching, of all the things that Jesus did. There came a time when the people said, well, this is just too hard. And they walked away. And Jesus had to look at his 12 and say, are you going to leave me also? So here we saw people. No, we didn't see. Here we know of people who saw the water turned into wine, who saw the dead raised, who saw the lepers cleansed, the blind healed, the lame healed, who saw the spirits, unclean spirits taken out of somebody, and they went into pigs, and the pigs ran into the ocean and drowned. We see they saw the calming the storm. They saw the feeding of the thousands with a handful of dried fish. And yet they looked at Jesus and said, no, we've had enough. Don't believe it. Bye. What would cause that?
They could be blinded. The scripture talks about that. God creates faith in a man or woman. And I meant to, when I said man, I meant that includes the human race. God shows us things.
Okay.
He opens doors. He closes doors. And I don't know what the right words to put it in, but now to put it in a more modern perspective, I run into people on a fairly regular basis that are not able to accept certain things. And that just may have been a factor here.
Well, why? Environment. Okay. That may be part of it. Environment they were raised in.
Romans 1 gives an indication of some that would rather worship the creature rather than the creator.
And worshiping the creature rather than the creator, really what Paul is getting into is worshiping what?
Yeah.
Ourselves.
In their case, it was self. Yeah.
Self.
Another thing, not going to submit myself. There's nothing. What is humanism? It's the statement that there's nothing beyond.
There's nothing greater than me.
Of man.
I am the greatest of all things, and nothing's greater than me, and I'm not going to bow to anything.
Right.
That's humanism.
Humanism, that's right.
Some of these folks were fearful of their associates, whether it be the Sadducees, the Pharisees.
Okay. Some were just scared. Yeah. For whatever reason, and there are lots of different reasons. There is a word called bias. Are some people predisposed to have a bias against a belief in God? Yeah, we've just talked about some people that are like that. Bias is a very hard thing to overcome. We have this idea that if there is a researcher in a laboratory and they're dealing with something in thermodynamics, or they're dealing with something in chemistry, or they're dealing with something in bridge structures, or they're dealing with something that would involve statics, and if they're involved in flight or aerodynamics, if they're involved, whatever, in a lab. The scientific principle, basically in a nutshell, is we look at a problem. We pose a hypothesis or a possible solution. You perform experiments. You have to define and create those experiments. You experiment. You collect data. You look at that data. Am I right? And what you do, am I right? Then you look at that data, and does your data support your original hypothesis? That's what you're asking. And we would like to think that there is no such thing as bias in scientific inquiry. But that is far from right. Albert Einstein even pointed out that it is impossible in a scientific inquiry to eliminate bias. So we have a tendency to have our thinking, our opinions, our emotions, our what we want. We, as humans, have a tendency to let that get in the way. Can you think of a famous time in the Bible where a particular ruler knew what was right, admitted what was right, knew what was right, but could not bring himself to do what was right? Well, the rich young ruler may be one of them. Pilate. I'm thinking of Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Do you remember the plague of the frogs?
They everywhere.
And Moses went back to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go. Don't you see there is a God in heaven?" And what was Pharaoh's response? "Yes, I believe there's a God in heaven. I believe your God is more powerful." But then, what did he do? He said, "I'll let your people go tomorrow." He could have eliminated the plague of the frogs right then. But he didn't. And there's a very famous sermon called "One More Night with the Frogs." So he, knowing what's right, knowing what he should do, knowing and admitting that there is a God in heaven who is orchestrating all of this, he cannot bring himself to do what he knows he needs to do, so he decides to go to bed with the frogs another night. And we know that the next morning, what happened? Well, his heart was hardened, and he's going, "No, I'm not going to." So we get back to this idea of faith. And this parable that we're going to look at, God, Jesus, is asking about faith. And it's a really odd question that Jesus asks. So let's turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 18. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 8. Okay, and I know this is it's not a 2 or 3 verse reading. Would somebody be willing to read all 8 verses?
Verse 8.
1 through 8. Luke 18.
Then he spoke a parable to them, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God, nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while, but afterwards he said within himself, though I do not fear God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust said, and shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?
Do any of you find that to be an odd question after this parable? I do. So we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about why is Jesus asking this question? What is he referring to, and what does he want from us? So let's set the stage. We talked several weeks ago about context. Context helps here. Okay? So this is 2,000 years ago in the area of what we call the Middle East, Palestine, Holy Land, whatever term you want to apply to it. And so the role of women at that time, how justice was dispensed at that time, has something to do with this parable. So first of all, when we have a trial, or there's going to be a court decision made, we have a building called a courthouse, and we have a courtroom, and there's a bench, and a judge sits behind the bench, and the judge listens to both sides, and if it's not a trial jury, then the judge makes a judgment decision. We may not agree with that judgment decision, and we would like to think that the judge rules completely on the rule of law, and that the judge's opinion, personal opinion, never enters into that decision. We would like to think that, but what did we just say about bias? It's really not possible. So when we want to whine and complain about, well, this judge made this ruling and I don't agree with it, just remember that it's quite possible and altogether likely that we couldn't have done any better. Because just as that judge's personal opinion can come out, so does ours. Anyway, so what was a judge, what we would call a court, how was that done back then? Well, unless you were in a very large city, and unless there was a king or a governor that had a palace and had a throne room or had a courtroom, then what we would call district judges, local judges, they went from place to place, and they would pitch a tent.
District or circuit?
Either one, really. Well, circuit too. Circuit. Yeah, I should have said circuit. And they would pitch a tent. So they would go to Cortland and pitch a tent for a while, and then they would go to East Lawrence and they'd pitch a tent for a while, and they'd go to Moulton, they'd pitch a tent for a while, and they'd go to Speake and pitch a tent for a while, and then they would go to Mount Hope, Hatton, go to the different communities. They'd pitch that tent, and they would sit under the tent. And the people that had some kind of grievance against somebody else, they would come to the judge. Okay? So it's not like the people going to the judge necessarily, it's more like the judge going to them in local communities. And everything sounds just well and good until you get to the role of women. What do we know about women when it came to law, court proceedings, legal discussions? What do we know about the role of women?
At that time, it wasn't very credible.
You usually had to have a man go for her.
That's right. She had to have a man go for her. She was not, in most situations, allowed to go under that tent. Now, anybody that wanted to could stand out around that tent, in the perimeter, around that tent, listening, whatever. They were supposed to be quiet. But usually only men could go underneath that tent and come before the judge. Well, there's something else that enters here that is not mentioned by Dr. Luke, but each judge had assistants, 2 or 3 or 4 assistants. So how did you get your case before the judge? Well, you had to go with one of those assistants. The assistants lined up the cases for the judge to hear. Okay? So you've got these assistants. If I've got a beef with Bill and we're going to go to the judge, then we're going to go to one of those assistants, and the assistant is going to put us on the docket and give us a time, and we'll show up. Right? You follow me? But how did it really work? If I wanted to go before the judge, what usually had to happen? Everybody do this. I had to pay one of those assistants to get my case before the judge. Now, who's going to take their cut?
Assistant.
The assistant's going to get paid, but who's going to take his cut? The judge. So, we have the case of a wicked judge. And the judge is going to side for whoever's offering to pay. Okay? Wicked judge. So you have this widow. She has, some versions say she has an adversary, some versions says she has an enemy, some version says she has somebody who is persecuting her. She has some problem with another person. She's a widow. Can she get under that tent to bring her case before the judge? No. Probably not. She would have to pay a man to go for her. And the case with widows back in that day and time was not to be a widow was not a good situation. So what is she doing now?
Evidently, she has the means to persist.
She can persist, but where would she be standing? Outside the tent. But what is she doing?
Yelling.
She's yelling at the judge, creating a commotion. And we can only imagine what she's yelling. Give me some relief. Consider me. Look, you crooked judge, I don't have enough money to pay a man to come in there and plead my case, but you need to hear me anyway. Which is kind of what the judge says finally to himself. If that woman doesn't hush, what's going to happen?
He can't get anywhere with his court.
He can't get anywhere with his money. His pocketbook is about to be hit.
Well, that's what I'm referring to.
Now here again, different Bible versions have a different phrasing here. Some say that the judge says, I'm going to rule for this woman because if I don't, she is going to attack me. Others say she is going to vex me. Others say that she is going to expose me. Take your pick. He feels threatened by her.
Probably a little crowd out there.
A little crowd out there.
Yeah.
He feels threatened by her. But the idea is she doesn't do this once. She is doing this consistently, constantly, perpetually, just over and over and over and over and over. To where he finally says, I'm going to have to give her what she wants. Okay? Now, what is the conclusion to the parable? Jesus talks about what? If that unjust judge will finally listen to that woman and do what she wants, what's the comparison?
God. And how his
think about how God in His goodness will certainly do that. So we get this idea that this is a parable about persistence in prayer. And in fact, verse 1 says that this is a parable about prayer. But then Jesus turns around and says, and when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith on earth? So here's my question. I gotta check the time. What's faith got to do with this? I thought this was a parable about prayer and being persistent in prayer. What's faith got to do with
If
this?
you pray without faith, your prayer is not likely to go past the ceiling.
Okay, let's go back here,
Okay.
Chris.
Yeah.
In verse 7,
Uh-huh.
he's talking about, and shall not God avenge his own elect which
Mhm.
cry day and night?
Yeah.
And that's showing faith from the elect, the ones
Okay.
that have been obedient.
So, do you think the widow had faith? Now, what I mean, not faith in God necessarily, but do you think she had faith that sooner or later that this unrighteous judge was going to listen to her and help her?
If not, she was gonna keep screaming the rest of the day and probably the next.
Okay? So, again, the question is, did this widow show faith?
Yes.
What faith in what, Bob?
And him finally doing it. If she in all her heart believed that he wasn't going to help her ever, she probably would not have been there.
Okay,
She would have gone another avenue.
all right. So you put it well. If she did not believe in all of her heart that that judge was going to do what's right by her, then she probably would have quit. So I want to go back to people who walked with Jesus, saw the miracles, heard him speak. I was laying awake the other night, not been able to sleep the past week. I was laying awake the other night and something just popped in my mind. Have you ever wondered what Jesus' voice sounded like? Was it Daddy sing bass? Mama sing tenor? Somewhere in between? Do you just wonder things like that? I don't, maybe I'm crazy. I do. What did he sound like when he stilled the storm and he said, peace, be still? Was it peace, be still? Was it peace, be still?
I think it was with authority. His voice would be authority.
Okay.
And the way he says it in that presentation, loud or just straightforward.
But people heard that, Alan.
Yes.
Remember the people that were amazed that he spoke as one with authority?
Yes.
When he opened his mouth, they could tell the difference between him teaching and the Pharisees teaching. There were people that heard that voice, that saw him, that saw the miracles, the people healed, the people raised from the dead, all of these things going on, and they turned and walked away. This widow did not turn and walk away. She kept on what she was doing. What's the difference? Bob, I think, nailed it. What's the difference?
Persistent faith that he was going to do what she wanted.
She knew deep down in her heart that if she did this long enough, that judge, even though it was wicked, that judge was going to take care of her. Deep down enough in her heart. So when we look at the people that turned from Jesus and walked with him no more, what do we have to conclude about their heart?
It was hard.
It was It was not real faith. Maybe they were walking with him to get the free food. Maybe they were walking with him because they just considered him entertainment. They get to see somebody healed. Maybe they walked with him because they thought, well, this kind of makes me important. You know, he's the leading teacher in the land. He's got all this attention, and I'm walking around with him, so it makes me feel good. Whatever reason that they were walking and listening and interacting with Jesus, it's obviously not for the right reason. It's not deep enough. So he turns around and then he asks a question. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? So what do you think Jesus is really getting to right here? What is he pointing out? What is he wanting people to understand from this exchange?
It should be some substance of your faith.
And how much substance?
I say that because back right prior to this, not too many passages back, he healed 10 lepers and only one returned. And, you know, I can't think of anything at that time probably any worse than being a leper.
Oh,
Because you
no,
think
goodness,
you're not going to get well,
no.
and you're ostracized by everybody. You're not allowed in anybody else's company.
Yeah.
And if these other guys, these other 9, why would only one realize that he was healed and would come back and thank Christ? And the other 9 just, sorry, I got off.
That's fine. We got 5 minutes. We're fine.
Uh,
I want to show you here contrasts and how Jesus is teaching real quickly. Jesus is teaching and trying to explain prayer and, more importantly, faith by contrasting. Okay? So there are 3 really big contrasts here. Contrast number 1. There is the perfect, loving, caring God contrasted with the wicked judge. Contrast number 2. There is a situation where this woman is not being taken care of. And while she's not being taken care of, she has no way, except the way she found. She has no way to come into the presence of the judge. Contrast number 3. She goes to the judge never comes to her. So what Jesus is also doing is he's trying to explain to these people, here is an earthly situation, but by contrast, here is how much better we have it, we would say, in Christ, in Him. We have an advocate. She had no advocate. We have a way of expressing, talking to, making known our desires, our feelings to God directly. She had no way of approaching that judge directly. We have the privilege of talking to the perfect, loving creator of the universe. All she had was a wicked judge. How much better do we have it than what she had it, than what she had? So, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? What is he saying here? Will there be people that will say, yes, I have faith in you, Jesus. I have faith in you, God. Oh, yes, I have faith. See, I even come to Wednesday night Bible class.
Boy, what a sacrifice.
But what is he really getting to here? What is Jesus really exposing here about our faith? Bob, I think several minutes ago you nailed it. He is looking for people who have such faith, such a conviction, such a deep-rooted faith in their heart, they will not quit, no matter what.
Look at the apostles. All of them but one, I think, died a violent death, died for the cause.
As far as we know, that's true.
Or no, they didn't quit.
And don't think that John had an easy life either, because we say exiled on the Isle of Patmos. That was not a vacation villa. No, that was a slave colony where people mined minerals, and quite likely he was forced to be a miner, a slave miner. Probably lived in a cave. In fact, on Patmos there is a small cave about the size of this right here that historically, by legend, that was the cave that John lived in on Patmos. And you're talking about a rock for a chair, a rock for a bed, and a rock for an eating table. And not much victuals to put on that eating table. It was not a good life.
I like one thing, I wrote here tell this last week, but I didn't. I'd like to tell it now. I was fishing.
You got 1 minute.
I was fishing on Brushy Lake, bass fishing with Kyle Nelson. He was a medic in the 10th Mountain Division. And we were talking.
You got less than 1 minute.
Well, we were talking about this, and I said, we talked about that scripture, we walk by faith and not by sight. And I told him I have seen so many prayers answered that I don't feel like that I walk by faith. I feel like I walk by sight because I've seen these things. And he told me a story. They were ambushed by the Taliban, and his platoon was spread out. They threw the rucksacks off and got behind them. And the Taliban was up on the mountain, and they're hammering out with them. And all of a sudden, this 122 millimeter rocket comes off the top of that mountain. And that is a big, powerful rocket. It's not like RPG. It leaves a 10-foot hole in the ground. And they're looking at that thing coming off that mountain, and everything just goes into slow motion, and all of them's like, oh, this is going to hurt. And all of a sudden that thing comes down there, and there's these two guys on the end of the line, and boom, right on top of them, that thing goes off. And it just stuns everybody for a minute. And the sergeant's immediately on the radio saying, we've got 2 killed, and honor for what he needs. And the smoke, the dust started settling down. They lost sight of them for a minute, and the dust starts settling down. And they get to where he sealed it. And all of a sudden out of that dust, they start hearing 2 M16s just hammering. And there are those 2 guys. And he said, what I witnessed was absolutely impossible for them 2 guys to have lived through that. And they didn't even do a scratch. And we, as Christians, if we live long enough and are fortunate enough, God will show us things like this to let him know that he is there.
One last thing. What is greater than faith? Love. 1 Corinthians 13. Of these, there's hope, faith, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Why? When Paul argues this, why? What's his reasoning?
Love comes drive faith.
There will be a time when we don't need faith. There will be a time when we don't need hope. There will be a time when Christ returns, faith and hope become reality, but love abides. So in Paul's argument of those 3, the greatest is love. Thank you for participation. We are going to draw this series of lessons to a close. The quarter starts, next Sunday. And so we'll pick up with something, another topic next Wednesday. Thank you.
Have you ever heard of the Conscience Fund? I guess not. The Conscience Fund. Internal Revenue Service has a Conscience Fund. You ever heard of it? A little book called Quest for Character details the information there. The way it got started was in 1811. That's a long time ago. 1811. Somebody anonymously sent $5 to the Treasury in Washington, D.C. And they kept it, and they started what is called the Conscience Fund. At the time the Quest for Character book was published, there was $3.5 million in the Conscience Fund. That is, people that gave money, not their name, but as was the case with the initial $5 that they received, the individual admitted that he had defrauded the government and his conscience was bothering him. So if you're feeling guilty about something, you can send a little money to the Treasury that away and relieve yourself of the burden, right? Well, it's kind of humorous to think about anybody really doing that, but they did. They did. And of course, in reality, what we're talking about is not somebody trying to appease their guilt for how they've treated the government. We're talking about heaven. We're talking about the eternal bank of good things. All the gifts and promises that God has promised. We're talking about how humans sometimes reach a point where they have a guilt. And in order to have that burden lifted, isn't that what Matthew says in 11:29, isn't it? You know, I take my yoke up on you, I am meek and lowly. Your burden will be light. Yeah. It's interesting that God sees that we need something. We need a reason in order for that burden of guilt to get off of our shoulders and leave us. And so we have the opportunity through Christ, of course. You know, come, let us reason together, Isaiah says. Isaiah 1, verse 18. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as what? White as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be like wool. Come, let us reason together. God is pleading with Judah in that chapter to come and reason with me. Now, I want you to come because you need it. And I'll be gentle. Time after time, when we talk in circumstances like this and we offer an invitation, do we really see it as an invitation? Or do we see it as a judgment? Because you see, with guilt, you've already made the judgment. And so if you're feeling that way for any reason at all, here's an invitation. Come unto me, those of you who are burdened. I'm meek and lowly, and I'm gentle. What does God really want to do? He wants to take the burden off your shoulders. And if you need that for any reason tonight, whether it's to obey God through the gospel of Christ, believing Jesus is the Son of God, being baptized into Christ for remission of sins, or if it's just because as a Christian you've somehow gotten a burden that you want to get rid of. If there's any way in which this was something that you feel the need for, would you come as we stand and sing?